dollar diplomacy, thank you, dollar diplomacy or debt trap, examining China's roles in the Western Hemisphere. We'll focus on China's growing role in Latin America as well as its implication on United States national security. Without objection, all members may have 5 days to submit statements, questions, and extraneous material for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. I will now make an opening statement and then turn it over to the ranking member for his opening remark. Okay, my opening statement. Good morning, everyone, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today. I have long felt the United States doesn't spend enough time engaging with our own hemisphere. It is my view that under successive administrations, both Democratic and Republican, the United States has paid too little attention to Latin America and the Caribbean. And it's now clearer than ever that China is filling the void. Since 2002, China's annual trade with the region has increased from $17 billion to $300 billion. 17 countries in the region have now joined its Belt and Road Initiative. The Chinese government has provided over $140 billion in loans to Latin American countries. And China has now surpassed the U.S. as the top trade partner for Brazil, Chile, and Peru. Some of China's investments had helped countries build much-needed roads and bridges. However, I have deep concerns about the negative financial impact of many of these projects on our allies. Moreover, I believe China's involvement in the region poses significant national security challenges that we need to examine much closely. In Venezuela, China has propped up a brutal dictator, providing $70 billion that enable Maduro and his cronies to plunder state resources while mortgaging their country's future. China's state-backed telecoms giant ZTE has helped the Maduro regime develop a system of social control to monitor people's activities and voting behavior and distribute or withhold state resources depending on their loyalty to the regime. In Ecuador, China has constructed a multi-billion-dollar dam that is an engineering nightmare. The Coca-Cola Sinclair Dam is only 2 years old, but has thousands of cracks. It is routinely clogged with debris, and it sits next to an active volcano. In the words of Ecuador's energy minister, China took advantage of Ecuador. Now, Ecuador is exporting 90% of its oil to China to pay back the debt for this disastrous dam. China's engagement goes well beyond securing access to natural resources. Chinese state-backed companies have carried out over 20 port projects, obtaining access to strategic waterways like the Panama Canal and creating serious security concerns for the U.S. Its telecommunications company, ZTE, and Huawei have built networks in at least 24 countries, despite their record of stealing intellectual properties and helping the Communist Party conduct spying and surveillance. In the last 3 years, China has worked aggressively to isolate Taiwan, successfully persuading Panama, the Dominican Republic, and El Salvador to no longer recognize Taiwan. China also pursued an ambitious soft power agenda, opening more than 40 Confucius Institutes and bringing Latin American journalists to China to expose them to propaganda that whitewashes the Communist Party's repression of its own people. We need to be clear-eyed about China's ambitions and the impact it is having in the region. And we shall meet the challenges of China's rise by deepening U.S. engagement with our own hemisphere, not by cutting our diplomatic and foreign assistance programs. I look forward to hearing from the experts with us today about what the U.S. can do in accordance with allies to address the China challenge and advance our shared interests. Thank you, and I now turn To the ranking member, Mr. Yoho from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. I appreciate our witnesses being here. Before I start, I got to give a shout out to Mr. Dean Phillips of Minnesota. He and I participated last night in the Celebrity Chef Cook-Off for the March of Dimes, and he was the winner of the event, so congratulations.
What did you bring?
We look forward to your potato
latkes. That's the magic, potato latkes. Thank you, Mr. Yoho.
You betcha, man. I appreciate you doing that. They raised $1.3 million for a March of Dimes.
Oh, that's true.
It is. I can't thank you enough for having this hearing. And to stress the importance of this hearing, this is the third meeting on China in foreign affairs this week. If I'm China, I'd probably say, isn't that great? You know, they're focusing on us because we have done so much. Yes, it is, and we commend them for their success, but not at the expense of other nations. Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for holding this hearing today on a very timely topic for China and the Western Hemisphere. The issue of China is one that I follow closely as a ranking member of the Subcommittee on Asia and the Pacific and Nonproliferation. First, I want to start off by recognizing the ranking member of this subcommittee, Mr. Francis Rooney, who is out recovering from his recent surgery. We wish him the best for his recovery and look forward to seeing him back here in this chair real soon. I'm deeply concerned about the increasing influence of China in the Western Hemisphere. Just last week, I returned from a congressional delegation visit to the region with Chairman Series and Mr. Meeks, Ms. Torres, and it was clear to me in my conversation with many regional leaders that they also share our concerns towards China. The behavior of the Chinese government and Chinese firms undermine the sovereignty of national security, not just of their countries, but of the United States and the Western Hemisphere. The clearest example is China's involvement in Venezuela. It is no surprise that China has been involved in propping up the murderous regime of Nicolas Maduro. China invested over $67 billion in Venezuela and still owed close to $20 billion. The Chinese chose to invest in Venezuela despite years of economic mismanagement by the Maduro regime and its overt contempt for democracy and the rule of law. This is straight out of the China's playbook for engagement throughout the world and demonstrates how China refuses to adopt to international standards as it expands its global influence. As the chairman brought up, with China's Belt Road Initiative in Asia and Africa, the Chinese are now moving to implement the initiative in the Western Hemisphere, recently signing BRI agreements with Peru and Chile. Make no mistake about this, with the offer of the Huawei and ZTE technology that we know they've given to the Maduro regime, China is looking to harness and capture despotic, authoritarian regimes and give them a tool that they can manage their people and get their people to submit to serve their government. We are so blessed in this country to have a government that we say our rights come from a creator, not from government, that government's instituted by we the people to protect our God-given rights. Our government empowers people. That's Western democracy. That's what we do, and that's what China, Russia, and these other countries that are involved, in this case, China in the Western Hemisphere. They're picking up these people to take advantage of weak militaries and propping them up at the expense of the citizens. Let me be clear, we're not telling sovereign nations who they can and cannot do business with, and we understand that China will remain a significant trading partner in the region. But it is important that our partners in the region are aware of the inherent risk of closer engagement with China that include financial debt traps, lack of transparency in business deals, and undue political influence, among others. As you brought up, Ecuador is an unfortunate example of the risk of dealing with China. I'm not going to repeat what you said, but the way I understand it, the hydroelectric dam that they built can't even run at maximum capacity. I think it's only been run up to 50% capacity, and it vibrates so bad because of the poor stainless steel that was put in there that they're afraid to run it any higher. And then who would build at the base of a volcano, active one? The lack of transparency in China's business deals are especially concerning for the region as it contributes to the widespread corruption that many of these countries are struggling to address and erodes good governance. Thankfully, some countries in the regions have begun to push back and wake up. We welcome these opportunities as the U.S. strives to be the partner of choice for all countries in the Western Hemisphere. However, many challenges remain in overcoming the allure of Chinese influence in the region, and it requires increased and strategic engagement in the region that demonstrates the short and long-term benefits of doing business with the U.S. I was proud to lead on two important pieces of legislation, the BUILD Act and the Championing U.S. Business Through the Diplomacy Act, that will play a critical role in countering China's influence. U.S. engagement in the region must continue to highlight the U.S. priorities, transparency, corporate social responsibility, the protection of intellectual property, and long-term sustainable results. Congress will play a critical role in promoting the U.S. as the best partner of choice in the region, while also ensuring that China plays by international standards so it can help countries develop their own potential. Look forward to the testimony of the three expert witnesses, and I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Yoho. Let me introduce first Ms. Margaret Myers, Director of the Asia and Latin American Program at the Inter-American Dialogue. She established the Dialogues China and Latin America Working Group in 2011 to examine China's growing presence in the region. Before arriving at the Dialogue, Myers worked as a Latin American analyst and China analyst for the U.S. Department of Defense. We welcome you to the hearing. We will then hear from Mr. Brian Fonseca, Director of the Jack D. Gordon Institute for Public Policy at the Florida International University. At Florida's International University, Stevens J. Green School of International and Public Affairs. Is that right? Brian's technical expertise is in U.S. national security and foreign policy. Before joining FIU, Fonseca served as the Senior Research Management for Sociocultural Analysis at the United States Southern Command's Joint Intelligence Operations Center, South. Thank you for being here today. And finally, we will hear from Mr. Christopher Walker, Vice President for Studies and Analysis at the National Endowment for Democracy. Previously, Walker was Vice President for Strategic and Analysis at Freedom House and Senior Associate at the East-West Institute. And thank you for being here today, Mr. Walker. I ask the witnesses, please limit your testimony to 5 minutes. Without objection, your prepared written statement will be made part of the record. Thank you so much, and make sure that you please turn your mic when you give your first 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to thank the committee and subcommittee chairman and ranking members and other esteemed committee members for the opportunity to testify today. I'll be summarizing my written testimony, which I've submitted for the record. As China engages more extensively and with a wider variety of economic sectors in Latin America, this is a critical moment to assess the type, scale, and effect of Chinese activity in the region, and to formulate a well-reasoned U.S. policy response. With this in mind, I'd like to offer just a few thoughts on the ways in which the China-Latin America relationship has developed over the past decade, how it is now evolving, and some implications for U.S. relations with the region. I'd first note the need for us to be very clear about the extent of Chinese engagement with Latin America. We've seen remarkable growth in Chinese activity in the region, but we are not seeing a headlong, unfettered advance on the part of Chinese actors. Chinese economic engagement and influence, for that matter, is unevenly distributed across the region. China presumably has the most influence and the greatest capacity for exercising what some have called coercive economic diplomacy in those countries that depend heavily on Chinese trade, such as South America's major commodities exporters, or that have relied heavily on Chinese state finance or development assistance. And there you have Venezuela, Brazil, Ecuador, Argentina, and some Caribbean countries, and a handful of countries in the Central American region. China has indeed used its economic leverage in some of these countries to ensure, for example, that Chinese companies are awarded key contracts. There are also indications that some of these governments have weakened investment and other standards or are disregarding existing regulations to attract Chinese investment and facilitate trade. That said, China's economic presence in the region doesn't always guarantee support for Chinese objectives. Some governments, like Costa Rica's, have been seemingly dismissive of China's interests, or, as in Chile, resistant to China's model of government-to-government deal-making. Chinese companies have also frequently failed to deliver projects in Latin America, and Latin American countries have taken note of this, even in those countries where they have relative carte blanche. This is due in large part to a failure to practice due diligence and accurately assess risk. But I should say, based on our own analysis, that they've been extraordinarily successful in acquiring and investing in port facilities. The second point I'd make is that the China-Latin America relationship is evolving rapidly in ways that are both troubling and occasionally encouraging. China's economic objectives in Latin America are largely the same as they were about a decade ago: securing access to raw materials and export markets, promoting Chinese brands, and internationalizing Chinese firms. But the ways in which China defines these objectives and its approach to achieving them has changed over time and will have some implications for regional welfare. Efforts to integrate more extensively across the region's natural resource supply chains have left China with an increasingly dominant position in some of the region's strategic sectors. China is also supplying the region with a very different set of products than it was a decade ago: high-tech electricity transmission lines, cutting-edge telecommunications and surveillance equipment, for example. Some of these goods will be promoting of economic development, but the possible implications of others, like Chinese-made intelligent monitoring systems, as you've already mentioned, are exceedingly troubling. On the more encouraging side, there are some limited indications that Chinese companies are embracing global standards for corporate social responsibility in particular. Some are also partnering more extensively with local and foreign firms when striking deals in the region. But these cases are, again, limited, and there aren't any particular poster children, right, Chinese poster children in this respect. And finally, as concerns U.S. policy on the matter, I'd simply say, in the interest of time, that the U.S. must recognize that it can't replace China in Latin America. China plays a critical economic role at this point in the region that no other partner or group of partners can fill entirely. As a result, an us or them policy will be viewed as unrealistic by most all governments in the region. But we can try to ensure best outcomes in the China-Latin America relationship, in addition to boosting outreach, including through the BUILD Act, and I commend Congressman Yoho for his great work on that. But I agree with Chairman Sears that even more must be done in terms of engagement. The U.S. must also focus on strengthening governance, improving transparency, and fighting corruption to ensure better results and as level a playing field as possible for American and other international companies, or domestic companies for that matter. The development and enforcement of rules-based trade and investment mechanisms will also be critical to ensuring regional stability and a strong U.S.-Latin America relationship in the years to come. I'll end my comments there. Thank you again.
Thank you. Mr. Fonseca?
Thank you, Chairman Series. Gentlemen, it's an honor, absolute privilege to be here with you today to talk about China's, the role China plays in terms of its threats to U.S. national and regional interests. Although there's certainly a strategic and even aspirational intent to China's rise, there still remains elements of opportunism that guide its global and hemispheric engagement. Chinese activities across the hemisphere vary in size and scope, as Margaret notes. And although it's well known, it's still important to note that, that Latin America is not the only space in which China is aggressively pursuing relations. And so what that means is, from a strategic security perspective, Chinese engagement in the Western Hemisphere is undoubtedly part of a broader global effort aimed at shaping a world consistent with its authoritarian model. So in general, I assess four areas where, excuse me, where Chinese engagement in the Western Hemisphere is challenging U.S. and regional national interests. The first to include Chinese economic practices and the proliferation of Chinese surveillance and IT technologies, both of which I strongly feel undermine the efficacy of democratic institutions and expand Chinese influence across economic, political, and security landscapes. Whether intentional or not, China's economic engagement enhances Chinese influence in these economic, political, and security spaces, but it also undermines already struggling democratic institutions by inducing corruption and circumventing transparency and accountability, critical pillars to democratic governance. Chinese engagement also undermines rule of law and bypasses important environmental and labor standards. As far as Chinese investment in telecommunications, artificial intelligence, and other critical technologies, I feel it represents a serious concern for the United States. The concern is largely in the vulnerabilities of Chinese technologies from a technical perspective. There's also the potential that these technologies could serve as intelligence collection platforms against the United States and its partners in the region, and certainly there are questions about the overall impacts on digital sovereignty and norms. Third is Beijing's complex information campaign, where it's leveraging Chinese regional media platforms, Confucius Institutes, and overseas ethnic Chinese, and it's deepening people-to-people contacts in the region to build soft power and differentiate the Chinese brand from the United States. And then finally, Chinese military and security engagement is positioning itself as an alternative to U.S. security assistance and could influence security calculations of countries in the region in the long term, while also providing China with important access in this hemisphere. Additionally, China is emphasizing engagement with Latin American law enforcement agencies in a comprehensive way. This shows that Beijing acknowledges that domestic security concerns are more prominent than external security threats for the region. The influence of military institutions across the region vary. You can take Argentina as an example, where the Minister of Defense, that cabinet-level position is usually afforded to a member of the opposition. So it shows you the diminishing influence of militaries in the region. There's design to that. I would also sort of suggest that China's also expanding, that China's expanding engagement in Latin America will probably not lead to direct military challenge to the United States in the near term, such as the establishment of Soviet-style client-state relationships, military bases in the region, or open funding of anti-U.S. insurgencies. This is not, however, due to benevolence, Chinese benevolence. Rather, I think it's simply not currently in its strategic interest to do so. For now, it's far more effective to buy its way into the region. However, as Chinese corporations become more involved in Latin America and Chinese communities grow with respect to their political profile in the region, China may be increasingly tempted to engage in security cooperation with governments of the region to protect the interests of its corporations and nationals. China's position in Venezuela is a glaring example of its willingness to go against the region when its interests are threatened. So how do we respond to Chinese engagement in the Western Hemisphere? So let me lay out a few things that I think might be prudent for us. First, I think it's imperative that we disaggregate the good from the bad and resist labeling all Chinese activities as nefarious and antithetical to U.S. and regional interests. Not all Chinese engagement is designed to directly challenge the United States, and a great deal of it remains economic and opportunistic. This competition doesn't have to be a zero-sum, and I fear labeling the entirety of Chinese engagement in the region is detrimental to our own regional interests and could entice a self-fulfilling prophecy. At the same time, we must be cautious in divorcing economic interests from political and security interests and recognize that they are all very much interconnected. We should call it like we see it, and call out Chinese activities that we feel run counter to the short, mid, and long-term strategic interests of the region, while helping shape Chinese activities that benefit U.S. and regional interests. Second, we should bolster the governance capacity of our partners in the region. The U.S. should reinforce democratic institutions and values that create resiliency against China's ability to leverage its engagement to promote authoritarian alternatives. We should increase training in key areas such as human rights, transparency, anti-corruption, rule of law, and continue focusing on developing long-term sustainable relations with key partners. This makes tools such as international military education and training, IMET, a key instrument in developing people-to-people connective tissue. Third, we must truly embrace a whole-of-nation approach that strengthens our competitiveness in the region. Ultimately, this is about what we do and what we stand for, far more than it is about China. The rapid growth of Chinese engagement in the Western Hemisphere should serve as a call to competition, not a call to arms for the United States. And competition is something we do incredibly well. But to borrow a sports analogy, you have to be on the field to compete. And that means consistent presence and sustained engagement, a full court press of defense, diplomacy, and development efforts. The United States government should also find new ways to foster greater people-to-people contacts through exchanges among academic institutions, civil society, and of course the American private sector. Strong personal relationships grounded in shared values are our greatest competitive advantage. That said, we must do better to guide, inspire, and support our private sectors into strategically important markets, especially in critical technology sectors. We should also evaluate the usage of the 160 binational centers for Latin America throughout the region. Fourth, we should expand the franchise to include security engagement. And then finally, we must compete better in the information domain. The United States should expose and exploit the contradictions in Beijing's policy and the divisions that exist between China and the region, such as cultural differences, political differences, political systems, and business practices, including overpromising commitments and labor practices.
Need you to
I
wrap
know-
up, Mr. Fonseca.
Yes, sir. I know the Congress and members of this committee in particular are waking up to the fact that we need to pay more attention to this region. Nature abhors a vacuum, and if we're not engaged, the Chinese will. So with that, I thank you for this amazing opportunity, and I look forward to the questions.
Thank you, Mr. Fonseca. Mr. Walker?
I'd also like to thank the committee for the opportunity and privilege of presenting testimony on this timely and critical subject. China's economic engagement in the Western Hemisphere has been notable for its speed and breadth. In a remarkably short period of time, China has become a major investor and trading partner with a growing number of countries throughout the region. The central point I would like to emphasize, however, is that China's emerging relationship with countries in the region cannot be understood principally on the basis of dollars and cents. This is because China's engagement under the direction of the Chinese Party state is multidimensional, and its interaction with countries in the hemisphere brings to bear a wide range of resources that include but also are beyond the realm of commerce and economics. Through the Belt and Road Initiative and other forms of engagement, China's leadership is placing increasing importance on exerting influence and shaping political operating environments overseas. In fact, over the past decade, China has spent tens of billions of dollars to shape public opinion and perceptions around the world into arenas typically associated with soft power, which is understood as the ability to affect others by attraction and persuasion. Such efforts have included thousands of people-to-people exchanges, extensive cultural activities, educational programs, notably the ever-expanding network of Confucius Institutes, and the development of media enterprises with global reach. Media and information are especially critical in this era. Although information is increasingly globalized and the internet is accessible to larger audiences, China and other authoritarian states have managed to reassert control over the realm of ideas. For too long, observers in the democracies interpreted authoritarian influence through an outdated lens, even as China embedded itself in democratic societies as part of autocratic regimes' broader internationalist turns. China's engagement tends to be accompanied by an authoritarian determination to monopolize ideas, suppress alternative narratives, and exploit partner institutions. This unanticipated authoritarian engagement by states like China to exert influence abroad has created a need for new terms that can adequately describe this new situation. Chief among these is what we've termed sharp power. This describes an approach to international affairs that typically involves efforts at censorship and the use of manipulation to degrade the integrity of independent institutions. And this was a term that we developed through a report we released in December 2017 titled Sharp Power, Rising Authoritarian Influence. And so when we think about these issues, we have to keep this framework in mind. So let me just say a few words about China's engagement in Latin America, given the wider context. The media sector is critical. Beijing's strategy in this respect is multifaceted. First, it seeks to disseminate its messages directly through its state media presence in the region. Chinese state media outlets Xinhua and Chinese Global Television CGTN do not openly disclose the number of staff or bureaus they have in the region, but clearly their presence is growing. Second, China's state media are entering into partnership agreements directly with local media outlets in Latin America, which include placing paid supplementary materials in local media, content sharing agreements, placing other content into the wider media landscape, content co-production and training and exchanges of editors, journalists, and documentary filmmakers. As documented in our Sharp Power report, Argentina and Peru are among the countries that have various media partnerships with China. In Peru's case, an agreement between CGTN and the National Institute of Radio and Television in Peru emphasizes joint collaboration in news exchange, co-production, technological cooperation, and personnel training and mutual visits. In Venezuela, CGTN and Telesur maintain a joint cooperation deal. Technology is also critical. While a fuller picture of the technological reach of China in Latin America is only beginning to emerge, several recent reports have highlighted how Latin American governments are employing Chinese technologies in a variety of ways. Most notably in Venezuela, Reuters has reported how ZTE technology is powering the so-called Fatherland Card. In Ecuador, Foreign Policy Magazine and the New York Times have recently described in striking terms how loans from China have enabled the Ecuadorian government under former President Rafael Correa to purchase a nationwide network of 4,300 surveillance cameras from Huawei. And there's more to that story, but I'm going to leave it there. And let me just say a word about the Confucius Institutes, which get quite a bit of attention, but are only one part of China's engagement in the education sector. The Confucius Institutes are controversial principally because of their opacity and the way in which they operate on university campuses. The Chinese government's staffing and control of curricula ensures that courses and programming will subtly promote CCP positions on issues deemed critical or sensitive to the Chinese authorities, such as territorial disputes or religious minorities in China. So I would just say in conclusion that we have not had a proper frame for understanding China's engagement with the world, and we've been slow to recognize that in an era of globalization, authoritarian regimes, including China, play by their own rules that are often predatory and are keen to remove the goalposts on the international level toward their authoritarian preferences. So very quickly, just 5 quick ideas for how we respond. First, we have a pressing need to address the evident knowledge and capacity gap on China in Latin America and elsewhere. Second, we need to shine a spotlight on authoritarian influence so that these societies can better understand it. Third, we need to safeguard democratic societies in Latin America against undesirable Chinese party-state influence. And fourth, we need to reaffirm support for democratic values and ideals. And finally, we need to learn from our democratic partners who have been more deeply engaged on these issues and can share essential learning with partners in Latin America that are in an earlier stage of their relationship with China. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. Walker. Now we'll do members' questions. I will lead it by saying one of the concerns that I have is the fact that for years we haven't really focused Democratic and Republican administrations in this region. And now you take a look at China, and it went from $17 billion to $300 billion. What is the total trade that we have with this region? About $800 billion? Ms. Myers?
Are you talking for China?
Yeah, no, with this region, the Western Hemisphere. What our trade?
China and Western Hemisphere? Somewhere in the neighborhood of
No,
500.
our trade with the region.
I don't know exactly the number for.
Anybody know? I think it's something like $800 billion.
Something of that nature.
Okay, I just wanted to get confirmed. I don't remember the number. But my concern is if China went from 17 to 300, that's a sizable chunk. And I think we should be concerned on some of the things that they're doing. And in your comments, Ms. Myers, you didn't seem to be too concerned about China in this Western Hemisphere. Did I get the wrong impression?
No, I am concerned about what China is doing in the Western Hemisphere, but I would simply say that we need to be very careful about not characterizing the entire Western Hemisphere as being, under the thumb of China necessarily. It varies considerably, and considering that the U.S. has very limited resources and needs to apply them effectively, we need to think best about how to allocate those resources. So we need to think about those particular countries that are under greatest threat of influence, nefarious influence in certain cases, and then those that aren't, and then how to deal respectively with each of those nations.
Well, I just get concerned how quickly they got there.
Yes.
So in the next 10 years, if we're not careful,
it's been a remarkable rise.
The trade with China is going to be double. So I was just wondering, anybody else have any comment? How quickly this went from 17 to 300?
So I think what I would emphasize in this context is that the trade number has increased, but so has engagement in so many other spheres. And I think in the same way that the United States has been slow to recognize the abrupt and rapid engagement on the trade and commercial side, we've also been slow off the blocks to recognize the larger implications of China's engagement more broadly. And I think we're only starting to engage, and I think this hearing and others that are happening in the next week or two are so important to start putting into perspective the scope of the challenge.
And my other question, Mr. Fonseca, how can countries in the region avoid similar outcomes as the Ecuadorian experience with this dam and this, now that they're exporting 90% of their oil to China?
Yeah, Chairman, that's an excellent question. And I think, again, it centers on governance. It centers on our ability, and again, this is where I sort of put the onus on sort of our engagement and how we're able to shape some of those outcomes. I think that governance is a key issue. If you look at that dam in particular, just about every Ecuadorian involved in that is now in jail on corruption charges. And so, working that issue of governance, accountability, transparency, anti-corruption, I think those are really key in sort of creating environments that are more resilient to the types of Chinese economic activity.
Yes.
Might I add to that? We need to create or ensure a more inclusive environment at the very onset of the development of these projects. And that includes trying to ensure that civil society in particular is well advised and participating at the very earliest stages. Also a strong media presence. As it turns out, a lot of Latin American countries have been very responsive to New York Times reporting on cases like Sri Lanka, and are very aware also of the challenges associated in Venezuela. These are important cautionary tales for them. They take them seriously, and I think will apply them, in not all cases, but in some cases in their own decision-making.
I recently read an article where China bought a piece of property in Panama because they have this idea that they want to become the Amazon of the Western Hemisphere. I don't know if you read that article, but to me, it's like really reaching. Trying to usurp the U.S. influence in the area. I'm sorry, go ahead.
So I think on these issues of how societies, open societies, democracies in Latin America can deal with engagement, which is really full spectrum engagement from China, is critical. And I think at this point, as I noted in the first kind of key issue, is that until those societies have the ability to really understand China's foreign policy, the way in which its business operates, they'll be at a strategic disadvantage. And I think one of the things that we can do with our partners is to provide the sort of support and assistance that helps them help themselves. Because over the long haul, if civil society and journalists and editors and the policy community in Ecuador, where they really didn't have, as I understand it, a vigorous discussion about the ECU 9/11 investment by China in their security system, which meant that the society really wasn't prepared for the wider implications of how this technology would be used. Until that sort of knowledge and understanding grows some roots in Latin American societies, they simply won't be equipped to deal with this challenge.
My time is up. Ranking Member Yoho.
Yeah, I can't tell you how much I appreciate your testimonies. I mean, you guys are spot on pretty much on everything. There's a few I disagree with. But I think of right now, this is probably being monitored in China through the CCT cameras or whatever. We have a free society. And so we value freedom of speech, freedom of thought, freedom of expression. They despise that. But yet here we are talking about them so they know what our next strategy is. I don't know. I can only assume in China, they don't have open meetings like this saying this is what we're going to do in South America, this is what we're going to do. And I think we need to change our game plan. We had a hearing yesterday, and they were talking about the research and development that China does, these companies do, but those companies don't do that independently. It's the Chinese government directing that, putting the money in that. And so here we have the entrepreneurs, the people out there creating. Yes, there is some government money in R&D, but we're solely dependent more, I think, on the entrepreneur. And I think we need to change a game plan here in the United States. My question to whoever wants to first answer this, what type of countries is most likely to partner with China? Type of leader, the economy, strength of the judicial system, and rule of law? Anybody?
So, Congressman, I'll take a first stab at it. I mean, for me, governments that are, highly centralized, autocratic, have strong fear of opposition, these are countries that seem to be aligned with China very early on. If you look at the countries that China has considered, considerable support for, Venezuela, Ecuador under Correa, Bolivia, I mean, these are countries that there is a natural gravitation for China to engage in this region. And they're sort of like-minded, as I sort of referenced in my opening comments. I mean, there's a strategic interest in ushering in a global environment that embraces, accepts authoritarian political models.
All right. Go ahead.
I would simply say that China is most likely to engage with all of the countries in the region, but in very different ways. So, I mean, it's a completely opportunistic model. And so when there are opportunities to engage on a government-to-government level, which is the preferred model, they're going to do that. And that's been the case in Ecuador, that's been the case in Argentina under Cristina Kirchner, it's been the case in Venezuela. And often there you have very little transparency and you have, deals that do not turn out well. In other cases, Chile, there's a lot of engagement. And actually, frankly, I think some of that is a little bit more worrisome than what we're seeing elsewhere because it's at the high-tech level. It's going to ensure that China has a very critical place, both in terms of establishing a presence for the renminbi in the region, but also in terms of as a sort of beachhead for technology application and expansion. But everywhere, we're seeing things. It's just very, very different on a case-by-case basis.
Okay. Mr. Walker, do you want to add to that, or are you pretty much the same?
So I think it's not surprising that China has a certain form of relationship with governments that are operating in a similar way, which is to say prioritizing state power, marginalizing independent voices, suppressing free expression. That comes naturally. I think what's much more concerning in the last 5 to 10 years is the engagement that China has with other open societies and how it uses the open space and exploits it for purposes that are more consistent with those animating principles that you would find in China. And I think this is something that we haven't quite come to terms with yet, and we're only in the early stages of understanding, but it's something we have to accelerate our learning on quickly.
All right, let me ask you this. When China comes to a country in Latin America, do they bring their workers material, build restaurants and hotels that they stay at and promote a Chinese economy, or do they integrate the economies in those countries?
That largely depends on the country and the regulations that they have and how much economic leverage they have in terms of
But in a
negotiating
country
with
where
China.
you've got a despotic leader that's open for corruption and all that, what do you see?
Yeah, in those cases, yes, you do see Chinese
Okay.
workers coming sometimes, or in small countries, Bahamas, for example, that really don't have a lot of leverage in negotiations, you'll see that
Right.
happening as well. In Brazil, not really at all.
Okay, what is the attraction of partnering countries partnering up with China, keeping in mind China's halfway around the world versus partnering with the U.S.? Why China versus U.S.? Has it been our absence, or has it been our demand for all the things we believe in this country after 200-plus years of rule of law, equality, and freedom of speech and all that? What do you guys find? Mr. Walker?
I think I have to say right at the outset that we need to recognize that in places like Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, the Balkans, and elsewhere, there's a real need for investment. It's a fact. And at a very basic level, those societies are looking for investment, and China's offering it. I think that's one part of the discussion. I think what we're missing at this point is a more rounded discussion on the implications of Chinese investment in these settings, and what open and free societies and investment from open and free societies have as a competitive advantage for our partners. And I don't think we've made that argument as vigorously as we can, and we need to do that because China's making another argument. And I'm happy to talk more about that.
I'm out of time.
But
I would love to have another round if we get it. Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Thank you. Joaquin Castro?
Thanks, Chairman. It was mentioned earlier that several of the Latin American countries have signed on to China's Belt and Road Initiative. Where does Latin America fit into China's Belt and Road Initiative? Anybody's fine.
Thank you. It was in 2018, during the China CELAC Forum, that Latin America became officially part of the Belt and Road Initiative, but it's unclear what precisely that means. At this point, the Belt and Road has come to just simply encompass and define all of China's foreign policy, an ambiguous construct. These 14 countries that have signed on now, I think most recently Peru, these are non-binding contracts, or they're not contracts at all, they're memorandums of understanding. But most importantly, I think for China, they indicate symbolically a degree of support for China's broader foreign policy objectives and for China's presence in the region. So at this point, they're largely symbolic. What Latin American countries are hoping for, frankly, is an infusion of capital, especially in the infrastructure space.
Well, and let me ask you, we've had a big debate in this country about privacy and the ability of both government and private companies to review people's data, personal information. There are parts of China where people basically live in a surveillance state, and they've helped deploy that technology in other countries, including in places like Africa. Have we seen that in Latin America at all?
So, Congressman, I'll take that one. We are seeing the proliferation of Chinese telecommunications surveillance technologies in the region. Several countries have bought onto it: Ecuador, Bolivia, Argentina. Others have sort of inquired about and engaging and acquiring those kinds of technologies. I'm not finding any evidence in which China has breached any serious privacy issues there. I think one of the bigger challenges within this context of proliferation of technology is the actual security of the technology itself, right? Lots of independent studies out there sort of question the integrity of the systems, the cybersecurity components that are built into these technologies. And so I think that's on one end. The other end is, okay, that still may give China access to information in the future, though, again, some small cases out there globally that have indicated, some intentionality of the Chinese to be able to have access to that kind of data.
Well, it's clear that they're setting themselves up in certain places to be able to collect data and keep that data.
Yeah, I mean, in addition to the surveillance, systems, also the big data centers that they've been, engaging on throughout the region. So I think that, it's hard to define the intentionality of it. We're not seeing evidence that it's actually occurring right now. But I do take your point, sir, that they are acquiring capability in the future that could be leveraged to acquire or breach privacy.
Thank you. Mr. Walker?
Congressman Castro, you alluded to Xinjiang and others in your outset of your question. In essence, without any checks on the development of technology within the People's Republic of China, they're developing what some call a digital totalitarian surveillance state. The capacity to do this is baked into the technology that's being shared. We're seeing versions of this in Africa. I think the Ecuador case is something that needs to be looked at very carefully, because in the end, it's not just about the technology, it's about the norms and standards that are around it. To the extent that the norms and standards that are being set within China tend to inform, say, the packages that come to Ecuador, that's a problem for all of us.
Well, and it can become very tempting for governments when they have the capacity to surveil, to actually engage in that deep surveillance.
So if I may add one other, I mean, it is also important to note that the way China views the internet is distinctly different than the way we and the rest of the, Western nations view the internet. So digital sovereignty becomes a really serious question about the norms and behaviors, as Chris is referencing, that are being promoted by China.
Just very briefly, this is a critical point, and it's relevant to the region we're talking about, but other regions. This argument that digital sovereignty should be paramount is a euphemism for state control of the internet. And what the United States and its allies in the democracies are fighting for is a multi-stakeholder approach, not a multilateral approach, that basically would keep independence and a multitude of voices involved in the internet and its governance, whereas China's vision, along with countries like Russia and Saudi Arabia, is dramatically different. And this has massive implications for the hemisphere.
Thank you all. I yield back.
Congressman Michael Guest.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It appears to me from your testimony, both the oral testimony and the written testimony, that China is using a multifaceted approach, if you will, to gain influence in Latin American countries. That is by way of investment, whether it be direct investment or loans, technology, 5G, surveillance equipment, education that you spoke of in the Confucius Institutes, and we're also now beginning to see military sales as well as military training and military exercises between the Chinese government and governments within Latin America. And Ms. Myers, you spoke a few minutes ago that there are some countries that you feel that are at greater influence from China than others, and I'm assuming that two of those would be Venezuela and Ecuador. What other countries in Latin America do you feel that are at greater threat to Chinese influence than others?
Yeah, I mean, I was speaking from the economic perspective, and primarily it's those that are most economically dependent on China, either because they have a very, very small economy and are not receiving infusions of capital at all, or because they don't have access to international credit markets, as has been the case with Venezuela or Ecuador, Argentina in the past, and even Brazil has had some limited capacity there in recent years. Or those that have a really, really dependent trade relationship with China. Brazil is, a primary example there. Peru to a degree, Chile. These countries, despite having been critical at times of Chinese policy and Chinese deal-making, have, consistently worked to build even stronger relations. Most recently we've seen Bolsonaro be very critical of, in Brazil, be very critical of a lot of the deals that have been made in Brazil, and yet now we see most of Bolsonaro's cabinet and he himself talking fairly positively about the relationship. And I think noting that this is one that is extremely important for Brazil and that they are not able to really change the fundamental value or the way in which they're engaging China.
And would you agree that based upon the dynamics of each country, they're using different tactics, if you will, to gain influence?
Yes. China used an extraordinarily diversified approach to its engagement in Latin America. That it's not at all a one-size-fits-all model. It depends on the type of governance that we see in a country, the structure of the economy. China has used major infusions of state finance in countries that do not have access to international credit markets, for example. In other cases, it's competing actively through public-private partnerships or negotiating with the government on a wider variety of sort of technology or innovation packages. But it really depends on the interests of the country and the various ways that they can achieve their own objectives there.
Mr. Walker, let me ask you a question. In your written testimony, you talk about technology, and we talk about China exporting, particularly to Venezuela, to some extent Ecuador, but probably more Venezuela, technology that enables countries to collect personal data and track citizens' behavior. Will you expand on that just a little bit, please?
So I think what's important to recognize is that the fundamental principles that China, and when I say China, it's really important to emphasize, the authorities in the Chinese party state, that they're developing a whole suite of technologies that are designed for what they call social management. And it's, again, a kind of catch-all for surveillance, personal control, for controlling their citizenry. And in parts of the country, this is already quite advanced. I think what's so concerning now is that in a country like Venezuela, given the extraordinary degree of repression there, it's very hard for civil society to hold their own government to account. Moreover, if we look at more open societies where there's an opportunity at least to have a meaningful discussion about what China calls the digital Silk Road, which they seem to be emphasizing more, it's in essence a piece of the Belt and Road Initiative, but focused on providing loans and investments in the digital sector. I think we have to be incredibly vigilant in understanding the implications of this if we see more Ecuadors, if we see other countries that are adopting this technology, because as Congressman Castro alluded to, governments may be tempted to use these in ways that their own populations would not welcome. And in the absence of meaningful debate and discussion at the outset of agreements that bring this kind of technology into countries, it's very hard to unwind it and uproot it.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Congressman Espaillat.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Myers, I want to ask regarding the access to capital, the financing, and the predatory practices that China has been engaging in with Latin American countries. In fact, many have considered that this is a sovereignty issue because they're sort of like strangled for decades financially. What are the, I've been asking this question and I haven't gotten a clear answer from anybody. What are the actual provisions of those loans that are predatory in nature that will strap countries for decades financially and maybe put their own sovereignty in jeopardy?
These loans in Latin America are structured very differently than what we saw in Sri Lanka and in some other worrisome cases in Asia. And so for that reason, this notion of a sort of debt trap diplomacy doesn't apply as clearly in the Latin American context. That doesn't mean that these aren't problematic, though. One of the main features of the Chinese state loans, right, policy bank loans that we see in Latin America is that they're oil-backed. a lot of them, not all of them, but to countries that, have received a lot of them, like Venezuela and Ecuador, they are usually repaying these in oil. That was a way for China to mitigate its own risk, but it's become very problematic, since oil prices dropped a number of years ago. The model doesn't work so well when that happens. And as a result, we've seen, Venezuela really struggle to repay these loans, and a lot of the oil that they are sending is destined essentially for China and also for Russia to a degree. And this puts Venezuela in a very difficult position, obviously, but also other countries like Ecuador, which has a similar model. Also, in the case of Ecuador, we have there is a sovereignty question there, in that Ecuador received a lot of finance, promised a lot of oil in exchange, but that oil wasn't yet readily available. And so they had to make a decision to drill in a new area in the Yasuni, which is highly biodiverse, very controversial, in order to make that happen. And so that was something that wasn't forced upon them necessarily, but was necessitated by this loan agreement. So that, I would say, certainly is a sovereignty question. And then overall, the debt issue is concerning just how much debt these countries have as a share of GDP. It's not all Chinese debt, but Chinese debt is a significant portion of it. And that, of course, has implications for long-term stability.
Thank you. Anybody on the Chinese presence in the Panama Canal? I think we have ignore that a little bit, and I think it's crucial and strategically crucial that their presence there could be negative for U.S. investment and trade in general. Anybody on their presence in the Panama? Mr. Walker, anybody? No one?
Yeah, the Panama case is, I think, a really fascinating one, and one that we have to keep a very, very close eye on. It's kind of unclear how that's going to unfold. On the one hand, there have been a slew of deals, as you all know. They've been well reported. It's shocking, actually, how much activity there is in Panama. But these are mostly construction contracts. They're not investments.
Okay.
And Panama is not highly dependent from a trade perspective on China. So I wouldn't say that it's got this, extreme dependency issue. Nevertheless, there's a lot of interest in Panama in striking new deals, and a lot of interest on the part of Chinese companies in becoming even more extensively involved in some critical assets in Panama. Okay. And so if that happens, I think it has major implications. Already we're seeing major implications in very strategic areas in terms of potential surveillance and potential control over really critical assets that are, of course, critical to the United States from a trade perspective.
Okay, regarding surveillance, can anybody shed light on the 16-story antenna in Argentina, and what role is it playing regarding surveillance? Anybody?
Congressman, are you talking about the space?
Yes, correct.
So we're kind of classifying as a black hole, no pun intended, given the sort of the nature of it. But it's one of these really unique arrangements in which no one outside of the Chinese government actually has access to the facility, right? It's written for a 50-year agreement. There are provisions where you can put pressure, and that recently happened in Argentina, where they were able to restructure a little bit of that deal. But my sort of my assessment on the ground is that Argentine government officials can't walk into that facility and get a good sense of what's going on. So the speculation that's being used for things like intelligence collection, but again, there's nothing out there really concrete that we can hang on outside of the fact that there's just a lot of privacy, in sort of darkness surrounding that particular facility.
Thank you. I'm out of time. Thank you.
Congressman Chris Smith.
Thank you very much, Chairman Sears, and thank you, Mr. Yoho, for bringing up this very, very important subject of Chinese influence in Latin America. Let me just preface my question. Over the last several years, I have chaired the China Commission, my subcommittee, which I chaired for years on human rights. We held a whole series of hearings on Confucius centers. We petitioned and got the GAO to do a major study about how many, what are the terms and conditions of those Confucius centers. And I would ask that some of that be made a part of the record, if I could, Mr. Chairman, because it does underscore what is, I think, euphemistically called soft power. And there was an excellent piece in the National Endowment for Democracy called sharp power, because the Chinese are really in an all-out surge for global domination. I think it is real. I see it all over Africa. I've been on the Africa Committee for much of my time on this committee, and chairing or being ranking member now with Karen Bass. And of course, in Latin America, we're seeing it's like as one of our famous New Jerseyans have said, Yogi Berra, it's deja vu all over again. Everywhere we look, it's the same cookie-cutter approach by the Chinese government to influence other countries in this effort to, one, either fleece their raw materials, as they have done so effectively at bargain basement prices, and that includes oil, wood, and other precious metals, but also to influence governments, as all of you have made, I think, very clear. I would ask, if you would, my first question would be about these Confucius centers. One number put it at 19 Confucius 39 Confucius Institutes and 19 Confucius classrooms in 20 Latin American countries. But what I think most people don't understand is that, and when these university presidents, including our state, Mr. Chairman, invite them in, the teachers are handpicked by Beijing. They are told there's no Tibet talk. There's no talk about Tiananmen, and there's, the 3 T's, as they call it. And the bottom line is that any thought of human rights being discussed is a demonstrable no. So our own students, Mr. Chairman, are being inculcated in a very, very non-transparent effort to give Xi Jinping's view of the world every single day at these. They claim that it's a way of getting value added, perhaps more language skills, but there's a communist government agenda that permeates the entire thing, and it's all over Latin America, all over Europe, all over Africa, all over the world. Their hope is to get to 1,000 Confucius centers in just a couple of years. They're about halfway there. There's over 100 in our country. And I've asked hard questions. We had NYU here testifying because they have a center, a Shanghai campus. And what kind of influence is it when they give you the building, they give you just about everything and allow you to charge $46,000 per student, which is unbelievably high in China, and how much human rights talk will go on the campus in Shanghai, and who handpicks those students. So they're going all out, in my opinion. So the overarching question is about how they're trying to influence the elites, the academic community, and there's no academic freedom, I don't think, when you have a situation with the Confucius Center, certainly not within the confines of that. So your thoughts on that? The issue of debt, which you've already delved into, but again, I had another hearing last year on Africa. Ethiopia, Djibouti, and some of the other countries are so heavily indebted now, and if you could speak to it about the Latin American countries, because I think they're a little bit behind where Africa was, but they all said what terms, what conditions. They're great. They got huge amounts of money, and now they're, it's like the mafia. The reasons why these loans went out were not just goodwill or even good business. It was influence. We know in Brazil, the FAO is now, Brazil has it, the Director General, but China is now likely, they're supporting the Chinese government in getting that important UN position. So you might speak, I know I'm going a little long, but you might speak to the issue of what the Chinese are doing to influence the Latin American countries vis-a-vis the UN, because we know, they're making an all-out effort to get the FAO top job, and there will be others that will follow. So if you could speak to those, I'd appreciate it.
So I might just say a word about the Confucius Institutes at the outset. My understanding is that in Santiago, Chile, there's a one-of-its-kind Confucius Institute regional center, which provides training and support to all the Confucius Institutes in Latin America. So this doesn't get so much attention, but this is just a fact that you might find of interest. And I think as you stress, Congressman, the features that accompany the Confucius Institutes that I find most striking are the way in which they operate within what should be an open academic setting in open societies. And I'll just stress one point to provide a pattern that emerges across a host of the issues you alluded to, and that is in virtually all of these instances, the agreements that the Confucius Institutes have with the host institutions are confidential and not public. It's really a striking thing. And that doesn't necessarily mean that the content is problematic, but it does suggest that this absence of transparency raises some questions about what the conditions are and so forth. I would note that at a bare minimum, certainly in open societies, we need a better way to bring into the light things that are not in the sunshine. And to the question that came up in the last round of questions on the satellite facility in southern Argentina, apart from all the other questions that are raised, I think what's so striking, it was terribly difficult, as I understand it, for Argentine society to get a handle on what was really going on when that facility was coming online. And in the same way with the loan question, I think, again, separate and apart from any other aspect of this, what we should focus on is what we don't know about the loans. Because what I'm seeing now in sub-Saharan Africa is that independent civil society and investigative journalists are learning after the fact about elements of the loan arrangements that they find striking in terms of prospects of ceding sovereignty if the loan obligations aren't met, in ways that we've seen in other places that have been alluded to, like Sri Lanka. A country like Montenegro is in a very precarious position. Of course, we know the story in Ecuador. But I think this basic issue of transparency and how the societies that are engaging with China in the sphere of education, media, economics, technology, have the ability for themselves to understand just the nature of these agreements and relationships.
Thank you.
May I just add? Oh, I'm sorry.
We ran out of time. Congressman Levin.
Thank you, Chairman Series, and welcome, everybody. Appreciate your participation here. I want to explore further the implications of Chinese development projects for the people and the environment of the Caribbean and Latin America. A 2015 New York Times report on China's investment in international development rightly noted that China has a, quote, shaky record when it comes to worker safety, environmental standards, and corporate governance, end quote. And in Asian countries, projects that are part of China's Belt and Road Initiative have been criticized for degrading the environment, displacing communities, and threatening workers' livelihoods. Ms. Myers, have we seen these sorts of effects in the Western Hemisphere with Belt and Road Initiative projects?
We have, yeah. I mean, whether they're called Belt and Road projects or not, they seem to be, very characteristic of the BRI. Yes, some of the most, I think, concerning elements of Chinese engagement with the region are on the environmental and social side. Often because Chinese are accepting projects that are of considerable political interest occasionally to leaders in the region, but maybe not of benefit, broadly speaking, to the population. And they are often projects also that have been rejected by multilateral development banks in the past, Inter-American Development Bank, for example, or World Bank, for good reason, because they don't meet safeguards in place. And so as a result, we've seen communities displaced, we've seen rather, extensive environmental effects, and it's also because a lot of what China does is based in industries, sectors that happen to have really extensive environmental impact, extractives, infrastructure. And without the right safeguards in place to mitigate that, then the problems really are quite extensive. So yes, absolutely.
So, and if Chinese companies have been involved in these projects, have they changed their behavior when there's been international criticism, if there have been pressures within the host countries or local protests over whether it's environmental or labor, practices?
Yes, in some cases. I alluded to some interest on the part of certain companies in adopting corporate social responsibility standards. That is happening on a very limited basis. It's, good and encouraging, and if we can encourage that, that's great. That usually happens when Chinese companies become publicly embarrassed, and there's a reputational risk for China as a whole as a result. And usually that's the result of civil society intervention at whatever phase, or of media attention to a project gone wrong.
And do you see the likelihood, based on what the projects that are ongoing or in development, of further backlash in the years ahead, in the months and years ahead here?
There are a couple of projects in Ecuador, for example, that will probably encounter some backlash. There are also projects where companies have not done any sort of consultation with local affected populations that will probably run into some major trouble too. And I would say any of the large-scale projects that have been proposed, the Peru-Brazil Railway, things of that nature, may not ever get off the ground because of the controversy that it's associated with them, but if they were to, would be, a focus of considerable attention.
And let me just ask you and others another quick, broader question about U.S. policy. Going back to when Mr. Tillerson was Secretary of State, the administration has expressed concern about China gaining a foothold in Latin America and so forth. And yet we're pulling back our own involvement. For example, proposing massive cuts in foreign assistance and now cutting off our aid to the Northern Triangle countries. If China is indeed trying to gain a foothold in Latin America and the Caribbean, does it help or hurt their cause if the U.S. steps back and cuts foreign assistance to the region? How does this make sense, this policy of ours?
I can't imagine that less assistance or less attention from the United States will help our cause vis-a-vis China. We need to engage more extensively through the BUILD Act, through other mechanisms at the human level across the board in order to be able to sustain a strong relationship and have any chance of competing effectively.
And Congressman, I just underscore that. I think it's vital that we remain persistent and engaged at the region. I think this is vital to our interest. As I sort of referenced in my opening comments, if we're not there to fill that space, the Chinese likely will.
Thank you. I'll just end, Mr. Chairman, by saying that I feel like this committee is a bastion of bipartisanship, and I hope we can all work together to continue to aid and assist our friends south of the border here in this hemisphere. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Levin. Mr. Phillips, Congressman Phillips.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to our witnesses. The challenge we face vis-a-vis Chinese influence in Latin America, I believe, is both well articulated and well documented. And amongst the tools in our toolkit are, of course, the BUILD Act and the America Crece initiative by the administration. I'm just curious from each of your perspectives, are either having any impact yet, and prospectively, are those two examples of initiatives in which we should be investing more heavily and more focused on? And Mr. Fonseca?
Yes, sir. Congressman, I think it's certainly the right approach. I mean, any way that we can continue to mobilize, guide, inspire, support our private sector engaging, I think, is really vital. One thing that I will sort of note that I didn't have a chance to in opening testimony was, the ability to differentiate our security engagement. This is something that doesn't get a lot of traction. I mean, we're best in class when it comes to mill-to-mill engagement, right? Where we're not really effective is in domestic law enforcement engagement and really institutionalizing our ability to bring law enforcement, cooperation in any real meaningful way. And I only say that because that's one of the areas in which I see China differentiating itself from the United States. It is engaging in the region in a robust local domestic law enforcement environment, and the Chinese have stated that as an emphasis as part of their, their 2019-2021 plan, that they're going to continue to engage local law enforcement. So that's one of those areas I think we can continue to sort of pivot and cover ground, because we don't want to cede that local law enforcement space to the Chinese.
I appreciate that. Mr. Walker.
This is a terribly important democratic governance question, because using the Ecuador case as an example, it was ostensibly domestic law enforcement that would be that had privileged exclusive use of the ECU 911 system that China shared. And in the end, it ended up diffusing beyond that scope. And so, in principle, there's nothing to prevent that from happening in other countries in the region, absent, in my view, the sort of deep-rooted local capacity to understand these problems and deal with them over time.
Ms. Myers, and specific comments, but I want to know if there's any evidence of the BUILD Act already having any influence, if it's resourced appropriately, and if not, what we should do.
I don't know of any specific examples in Latin America, unfortunately. I know that we had a meeting yesterday, and there was concern on the part of a Caribbean representative that it would be difficult because of the middle income status of some Caribbean countries to actually apply those funds. It's possible, but requires a lot of bureaucratic work. And so any effort we can make, assuming that's an accurate statement, you all would know best, to make that an easier process and to really, facilitate the quick, application of these funds to needed areas, I think would be particularly helpful. In addition, I think these are both great initiatives. They're critical. It's important to apply them. In addition to that, I think there's a need to work a little bit more behind the scenes on boosting regulatory capacity. I mean, if regulations are there, they are followed, generally speaking, if they're there and well implemented, on helping civil society to understand this question a little bit better, and on potentially talking to Latin American countries about investment review processes and how to implement those.
Okay. One more question. Are any of you aware of any effort to compile an inventory of infrastructure efforts in Latin America and assess which ones might be vital to our security or economic interests?
The Inter-American Dialogue, I guess about 4 months ago, we put together a comprehensive list of transport infrastructure projects in particular, assessing each one according to its level of completion, who the actors are involved, which ones. China Railway stands out as being the prominent example or prominent investor in the region in this space, and by type, road, rail, port, bridge, you name it. What we found is that there are 150 projects that China has transport infrastructure projects that China has expressed interest in since 2002. About half of those have materialized, but most of that over the past 5 years. So definitely ramping up activity of late, and almost all of the really successful cases are in ports. Road and rail, not as much, but there is some progress on that side as well. What we're looking to do now is look at each of those successful cases, right, of investment, and try and understand what the implications are from a security perspective for the United States and economic.
Would you all agree, though, that it's in our best interest to identify comprehensively, not just transportation related, but comprehensively all infrastructure projects in Latin America, identify which ones are most impactful to us, and perhaps prioritize?
Absolutely.
Mr. Walker.
I would stress the technological dimension of this.
Yeah,
I think
exactly.
if anything, Ecuador, Bolivia, and Venezuela are indicators that this can grow extensively, and I just don't think we have a handle on it, so it's a terrific point.
All right. Thank you all. I yield back.
Thank you. We will now go for the second round of questions. Congressman Yoho.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Fonseca, is that close? Number one, thanks for being at FIU. That's an awesome university. I think you were the one that said we need to separate the nefarious from the good from the bad with China. I wish I had that level of optimism, as I'm more in line with Mr. Smith and some of the other members here. That'd be like me saying, I've got cancer and that's good because it helped me lose weight, but knowing it's going to kill me in the end. I just see nefarious things with China. I see no good with what they're doing, and I see their march around the world. And this goes back to, studying this for the last 7 years. Is China's goal, is it primarily trade, economic development, or is it strategic in ports and minerals, or bringing down Western democracies, in your opinion? And that's for the whole board.
So, Congressman, I'll take a first shot at that. I think it's all of the above. And this is where I think it gets really tricky for us because, I think we have to be careful in divorcing the economic from the security from the political. I think they are very much interrelated. I think, again, there is a hint of opportunism that goes to what China does in sort of the global environment, but it's just so overwhelming and so much, that I think that we should at least consider to pause and just sort of disaggregate what's good, what's bad. In terms of the tactical, operational level engagement, I think it's vital. You look at, and Chairman, you referenced, north of $500 billion has been invested in the region in terms of economic activity from the Chinese. How is that investment actually changing the game in the region to promote good governance, to serve the values and interests, sort of the that we uphold? And so how do we engage China in a way that we can sort of shape some of that outcome and some of that behavior? I'm somewhat concerned about creating a self-fulfilling
I'm open
prophecy.
for suggestions if you have them, because as you brought up, they're partnering up with law enforcement.
Right.
Well, I know the way they partner up with law enforcement is, hey, here's a tool you can monitor your systems like we do, or your citizens like we do, and I just don't see that paying off for long-term democratic societies that have the freedoms that we believe in the Western Hemisphere. And I see it working totally against that ideology. And I know China's offering their form of socialism with Chinese characteristics.
Right.
Their characteristics are social monitoring, citizen scores, you know, the eroding of democracies and going to totalitarian and becoming a vassal state of China. If you can convince me differently, I'd feel better, I'd sleep better. Anybody?
I think I would respond in the following way. They're related but distinct questions of what the Chinese authorities' goal is and what the effect and impact of their engagement is. So I think some of the speakers who are on panels yesterday talking about these issues talked about the paramount goal being the Chinese Communist Party staying in power. And if you accept that presumption, it leads to a whole set of ideas beyond China's borders. But I think if we're talking about the impact and the effect, then it comes back to some of the things that you and your colleagues alluded to of how societies that are engaging with China safeguard their own freedoms when they may be encroached upon by China's engagement. And that's the question I think we haven't come to terms with.
Right.
Congressman, can I just do a quick follow-up?
Sure.
Because I think it's an important question. You know, the engagement in the law enforcement space is largely because we're not there. You know, and I think that's an important sort of observation. They're engaging in that space because we're frankly not very effective in doing that.
When you say we're not there, I look at all the foreign aid we've given to countries in Latin America. It's over $5 billion in the last 10 years. And a lot of that goes to good governance, getting rid of corruption, and law enforcement. Is it not our absence, but is it the resentment maybe of our system that puts too much pressure on a country? And it's like, I'd rather go to China because that way I can control my people.
I mean, there may be some of those pressures there. You know, I suggested sort of the technology itself, like surveillance systems themselves, are not designed to go one way or the other, right? Promote or not, you know, sort of autocratic behavior. It's really the governments that wield, you know, the power over those technologies. And this is where, again, it's space that if we can continue to engage our partners and shape those outcomes, I think it's vital for regional and you know, sort of U.S. national interests.
I think long-term we're going to do fine. You know, an oak tree, when you plant an acorn, it grows straight up. People have a desire for liberties and freedoms. We provide that. They don't. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman. Congressman Smith.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Fonseca, I would like you, if you could respond. But let me just ask another question, too, you might want to speak to as well. In May of 1994, President Clinton de-linked human rights with trade, MFN, with the PRC. He did it on a Friday afternoon. I held a press conference at 6 o'clock. It's still on C-SPAN's archives. I worked along with now Speaker Pelosi in saying that there needs to be significant progress in the realm of human rights or else MFN's a goner. Well, we lost that opportunity when the delinking took place. And that has turned out to be the most false narrative ever, that if we somehow trade more, China will matriculate from a dictatorship to a democracy. It has not happened. They now pose an existential threat, I believe, to their neighbors and perhaps beyond. The military is, you know, what are they doing? Who is their natural enemy that they are so fearful of? It is an outward expansion like Putin, not a protection strategy that they've embarked upon. When it comes to human rights, they're a Tier 3 country on trafficking, and I wrote that law. They are an egregious violator of human rights on human trafficking, sex and labor trafficking. When it comes to religious freedom, they're a CPC country of particular concern, and it has gone from bad to worse under Xi Jinping, as I think all of you know. On December 27th, the Washington Post published an op-ed that I wrote called "The World Must Stand Against China's War on Religion." And I would ask unanimous consent, Mr. Chairman, if that op-ed could be made a part of the record.
Without objection.
I appreciate that. And I point out in the op-ed, and many China scholars fully agree with this, that the ruling Communist Party has undertaken the most comprehensive attempt to either control or to destroy all faiths. Falun Gong, Christianity, Muslims, Uyghurs, across the board, Tibetan Buddhists. And I don't know how that mindset does not bleed into their bad governance model that they are trying to promote worldwide. It has to at some point. Their surveillance state, as we all know, is just every church now has to have a surveillance camera monitoring anything anyone might say. So my question is, since all of these leaders now, not all, but many of the Latin American countries are reaching out to get these loans, which now makes them indebted and beholden to China, and other kinds of cooperation. Who among them, if any, has spoken out against this horrific repression of human rights in general and religious freedom in particular? There's even a word for it, synodization, where everything that anyone of faith or faith body organization, they have to comport with and do everything according to the communist model. Even Christianity, they're rewriting the Bible right now so that socialist principles will be embedded in the Bible, and whole parts of it are going to be excised out of the Bible. So my question is, are any of these world leaders, any of the Latin American leaders speaking out against this religious repression? When Xi Jinping comes in, every leader should be saying, hey, great to see you, but what are you doing on human rights? Look what you did to Liu Xiaobo, who got the Nobel Peace Prize. He died in prison, never got attention for the cancer. They let him die from cancer, and I think that was an act of murder. And then simultaneously, his wife was so maltreated as well. What a bad governance model. Somebody has to hold Xi Jinping to account. Please. And then, Mr. Fonseca.
So I think we can broaden the question, Congressman. Who beyond the region is speaking out at a high political level from the democracies? And why aren't they? I think it's a very good question. And it leads to something that we didn't touch on, but I think it's so critically important, and it's actually integral to the concept of sharp power. It's things that aren't said for one reason or another. And I think when the Chinese party state engages beyond its borders, it certainly can't control the entire environment in an open society. That's not what it's all about. It's about minimizing and sidelining those things that they would prefer not to have heard. So for a while it was the T's, it was Tiananmen, Tibet, Taiwan, right. But I think there's some evidence to suggest that the space for sidelining discussions is growing. And this is something that's very hard to track. It's in essence trying to identify gaps, things that aren't happening, but this is the preference, I think you've rightly identified, of the leadership in Beijing. And I think precisely because our assumption for the last quarter century that deepening economic engagement would lead to political liberalization and hence put our policies on a track that was in line with that overarching assumption, we've now come to realize that that isn't the case, at least for now. And at some point in the future, hopefully that will prove to be different, but for now it's not the case. And it's not just China. And I think as we come to grips with that, we're trying to situate ourselves in terms of appropriate responses at a time when we're working at a disadvantage. And I think this is key. We're actually starting from a weaker position because we didn't start to react, say, 5 or 10 years ago. And it makes it more difficult to get civil society up to speed, to understand how the Chinese party state operates and so forth. And until we do that, we're going to be at a disadvantage in meeting this challenge.
So, Congressman, I'll add, that we are, to underscore Chris's point, at a severe disadvantage when it comes to our ability to mount information campaigns that can rival, sort of China's charm offensive as it's become known. You talk at length about the Confucius Institutes and Confucius classrooms. There's sort of Confucius Institutes well over 40, and the sort of notion of embedding Confucius classrooms in secondary educational institution, again, is all designed to help cultivate a brand that China wants to wield as part of its portfolio of soft power. The other thing I think is really interesting in our space in the region is part of the charm offensive is designed to do a few things. Certainly one is the further isolation of Taiwan, and we keep talking about that. About half of the countries that still recognize Taiwan reside in this region. The other is to continue to stomp out, neutralize dissident movements like the Falun Gong. This is also sort of active in part of the region. The third is really to sort of counter pro-democracy movements, right? Again, ushering in this notion of acceptability of autocratic, authoritarian political models. The other unique thing that doesn't get a lot of traction is about the large overseas ethnic Chinese communities, right? In part of the role of Confucius Institutes in the Trauma Offensive is teaching Mandarin language to overseas ethnic Chinese as a means of being able to communicate to and through these communities to continue to promote sort of Chinese domestic and foreign policy objectives. And so that's all sort of cast underneath the notion of this charm offensive in which China's really actively been pursuing this.
Ms. Marias, I want to give you the last words before I close the meeting.
Thank you very much. I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think we can pretty much give up on the notion that China due to its, internationalization over these many years, is going to change its standards, its ways, its approach to human rights and other issues. It's not an ideal partner, especially is even an enabler, I think, of some bad practices in the region, especially among those countries that have weaker institutions. And that's why it's absolutely incumbent upon the Latin American countries themselves to have the right regulations, the right standards in place to guide China and to ensure best outcomes. And there are ways, I think, that the U.S. can ensure that those standards, those regulations are stronger, at least, than they are at the moment.
Thank you. Before closing, I just kind of find it ironic that the Communist Party has been bringing journalists from the region to China to sort of train them. It is a little bit ironic that such a closed society would actually tell the world that we're bringing journalists over to train them in journalism. Can you imagine that? Well, look, thank you very much for being here. It has been a great hearing, and thank you for your patience, and other members also. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now you're ready.